Fog over Tolbiac Bridge is Malice's masterpiece and an essential work in modern crime fiction tout court. It is also the most autobiographical of Malice's books, including many allusions to his life, his previous life, as an anarchist youth in Paris, the 1930s. The book has been published in 1956, and it has many references to contemporary France. Contemporary France meaning the France of the 1950s. There are, for instance, allusions to the war in Algeria. You see texts on the walls hinting at that war. Yet the plot of the book itself is triggered by a ghost from the past. And that ghost from the past is the so-called Tolbiac affair, a cold case from the 30s of robbery with murder. And little by little, Nestor Burma, who is the private eye, the protagonist of the story, will discover that the criminals were three comrades of an anarchistic community living near the Tolbiac Bridge in Paris, in a very ill-famed neighborhood. The story goes more or less as follows. After the robbery and the killing of a money courier, there was a dispute between three robbers. One of them will be captured by the police and convicted to a long sentence. The two others will change their identity and build a new life, betraying the anarchistic ideals of their youth. Many years later, in the 50s, the convict reappears. He is liberated after a 30-year sentence or something like that, and his return provokes different new tragedies and murders. Both the police and Burma start an investigation, but that investigation does not end well. This is not a happy end story. On the contrary, at the end, for instance, the love interest of the private eye, of the protagonist, will be killed. As this very brief summary makes clear, Malice's crime story is deeply rooted in French culture and history. No French reader will, for instance, miss the links with the so-called Bonneau gang, a French criminal anarchist group that operated from 1911 to 1912. This group was composed of individuals who identified with the so-called individualist anarchist milieu, a kind of right-wing, extremely pessimistic, negative group and ideology. And the members of that gang, of that Bonneau gang, used cutting-edge technology, including automobiles and repeating rifles, not yet available to the French police. So they robbed banks, they killed bank employees, customers, and they managed to escape thanks to their use of modern technology. That Bonneau gang is still very present in French collective memory, mainly via the widespread and ceaselessly updated iconographical representation of the violent robberies that made Bonneau and his accomplices public enemy number one. It's more or less, let's say, but in a less kind version, it's the French equivalent of Bonnie and Clyde. But Bonnie and Clyde in the 30s were more or less sympathetic figures, stealing from the rich in order to give to the poor. The Bonneau gang, on the contrary, were people who simply killed and stole for themselves. That's a big difference. Nevertheless, it's part of the imaginary having to do with good and bad in French culture. However, the main characteristic of the Burma series is less temporal than spatial. After some first books with the Burma character, Malek came up with the idea to create a full-fledged series with his private eye. And the unique proposal of this series was the geographical setting, more specifically the use of the 20 administrative boroughs that form the center of Paris. And each new episode of the series is situated in a different borough, in a different neighborhood, and tries to capitalize on the specific features of that neighborhood. Since these 20 boroughs in Paris used to have, each of them, its own specific characteristics. Paris, you have to imagine it as a kind of mosaic of initially independent, more or less independent neighborhoods and villages. So Paris is a city with a long history. whose different neighborhoods still have different forms and identities, in spite of the general urban streamlining imposed by Haussmann in the 19th century. In the case of Fog over Tolbiac Bridge, the story is set in the 13th arrondissement, or borough, in the southeast of the city. Today, this neighborhood is home to the new National Library and many high modern architectural ensembles. In that sense, it is one of the most modern, gentrified areas of the city. But for many centuries, it has been a dark and very poor industrial area with a very bad reputation. Today's visitors would probably no longer recognize the world described by Mallet in this book, and very faithfully redrawn by Jacques Tardy, who has seriously, thoroughly researched the historical reconstruction of the setting. The whole book is strongly marked by a kind of place-induced pessimism. Living near Tolbiac Bridge, so in the 13th borough, means trouble, and death is our only master. Hence the reason why the story has to avoid any form of happy ending. The murder case is solved, but it's only solved in order to produce new catastrophes. So the importance of the setting, which becomes a real narrative agent, almost the protagonist of the story, can be felt throughout the whole Nestor Burma series. And for that reason, it would be perfectly possible to argue that the series is less a crime fiction series, although it tells the adventures of a private eye solving all kinds of crimes. But it is perfectly possible to argue that it's a kind of sociological portrait of the city in the tradition of the 19th century literary realism as illustrated by Balzac. But now in a crime fiction setting. But the psychology and the description of the environment is at least as important as the crime fiction, as the crime story itself. And in the case of Fog over Tolbiac Bridge, the importance of the setting is absolutely crucial. This importance is further stressed by the strong autobiographical and nostalgic overtones of the book, which, by the way, also contains a 2-page map identifying with great precision all the spots where the major events of the story take place.